So a very warm welcome. Again, my name is Mike Nicholson. I'm the Development Director here at Selwyn College. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you. I know we have an international audience this evening. We've got people registered from many countries across the globe. And a particularly warm welcome to our principal guest speaker this evening, Tim Dee. Tim is an alumnus of Selwyn College. He matriculated here in 1980 and read English, and then went on to pursue a highly successful career in the BBC, in BBC Radio, Radio 3 and Radio 4 as a producer, and was responsible for many arts programs, historical features, drama, poetry, all sorts of things. And then in 2009, he wrote his first book, which, like his subsequent 5 other books, which he's written or edited, reflects his great passion and his knowledge of birds, of the natural world, and of nature, the outdoors. Tim, we're very pleased to have you here this evening, because Tim is actually in South Africa this evening, not in Cambridge. So it's the wonders of Zoom. And I'd also like to invite our interviewer this evening, Robert Hanks. Sadly for Robert, he isn't in South Africa, he is in Cambridge. But Robert shares many of similar backgrounds with Tim as a writer, as a journalist, as an editor. And indeed, Robert and Tim have made radio programs together. So they know each other fairly well, and who better to interview Tim this evening. So I should, just one point of warning, I should say that Robert does have a whippet in the same room as him, which happens purely by coincidence to be called Tim. So if you hear anybody shouting during the next 30 or 40 minutes, shut up, Tim. He's actually talking to the dog, not to our guest. So 1 or 2 housekeeping things here that I just need to get through, and then we'll be on our way. The interview will last about 30 minutes. You're welcome to leave questions at any time from now on using the chat function on Zoom. And I should say that only the panelists get to see the questions, so don't be shy. But also, if I could ask you to be reasonably brief with your questions. If they go on too long, they literally disappear off the screen, and we don't get a chance to read them properly or to share them. So with that request, I'd now like to hand over to our guests this evening, Tim Dee and Robert Hanks.
Thanks, Mike. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm happy to be here. I was last in Selwyn quite a long time ago. I do, though, actually some of the time live around the corner from Selwyn, in outside of Cambridge, in a little village called Swaffham Prior, but I haven't managed to be there this year, as people will understand. But so Selwyn is still somewhere in my geography.
Well, I thought where we might start is how I know you. I was for a long time a reviewer of radio programs, and when I decided I'd like to make some radio programs myself, I wrote to Tim because he was clearly the best producer at the BBC, and he did more interesting programs than anybody else. And one of the things that depresses me a little bit in a way is that we're here to talk about you as a writer. And that seems to me that's been a tiny fraction of your creative life. And you have this huge, distinguished back catalogue of programs which are languishing in vaults somewhere, and nobody gets to hear them. But
yeah, well, they're actually mostly in my flat in Bristol. I managed to secure the release of my raw tapes when I left the BBC in 2018. So
the BBC doesn't have them. You have
I was the new producer who was allowed to have a separate office crammed full of his stuff, my notebooks and my tapes. And I began my career on 1/4-inch tape. You know, the world was experienced at 7.5 inches per second. A second of the world was recorded in 7.5 inches of 1/4-inch tape. And I went on through cassettes and DATs and mini discs and CD recordings, and then inevitably towards where we are now. Digital recordings, sound files, and so on. But a lot of those things are now preventing me from living in my flat in Bristol. So do come around anytime you like, Robert. We can rehash the old days.
Yeah, well, I've got quite a lot of them myself cassette and CD. But let's talk about how you came to radio from Selwyn College.
Well, I was I read English at Selwyn. I had a magnificent teacher there called Wilbur Sanders, who was the director of studies in the English department, who was not interested in birds as far as I knew. Well, I was interested in birds, like everybody's interested in birds, but not interested in birds and literature particularly. So actually my English Selwyn time was a kind of non-birdie time, although my nickname given to me by, I think, Sam Collins, future prominent TV director and radio producer, was Scared Chicken, which he thought I looked like as I walked around the quad at Selwyn. But then I left, I did a degree in English at Selwyn, then went to work for 3 or 4 years for a conservation organization in Cambridge, based in Cambridge now, called BirdLife International, which was actually then called the International Council for Bird Preservation. I wrote the most boring book in the world on the endemic birds of Madagascar, some of the most amazingly wonderful unboring birds. But it was a very factual, dead book about mostly dead birds, as it turned out, birds threatened with extinction. And then I went to study, bizarrely, and thanks to Wilbur Sanders of Cambridge and Selwyn, I went to study Hungarian poetry for a year in Budapest, still in the dying days of the communist East. I went there because of Wilbur, because he introduced me to a single poem by a Hungarian poet called Miklós Radnóti in one of our classes, and that really switched me on. And I thought, at the point I was leaving my bird world then, the bird company, the bird charity in Cambridge, I knew I needed more ecology or more science to get on with conservation and science and bird science, and I didn't have that. So I went leftwards back to literature effectively, and then I came out of living in Hungary for a year. I was sent back as a British Council student at the end of that year, not with a degree, but with a love for Hungary and a love for Hungarian literature, and for some Hungarian birds, actually, wonderful birds on the flat puster, the great bustard, cranes and things like that, thrush nightingales, beautiful birds. And then scratching about for things to do, as you did in those days, and as we were able to do in those days, I applied to join the BBC as a general production trainee. And I think because of this weird mixed economy of things that I'd done and been interested in, I managed to get a place. And I then had a kind of hell-raising, nightmarish 2-month training time where you learn to use a razor blade in those days and a Chinagraph pencil, and went to various meetings, probably some of which might have been even attended by Roger Mosey, Master of Selwyn, who was at that point already a big man in the news world, I think, telling me how to be a proper journalist, none of which I paid enough attention to, because I knew I wasn't going to be a news journalist or work in the newsroom of any kind, although I was very interested in weirdly the changing politics, especially the cultural politics of Eastern Europe as it was going through the change, and the role of the artist in Eastern Europe. Anyway, all of that led me to a lovely series of attachments in the BBC to begin with, and increasingly focusing on arts programming. And I ended up working, first of all, substantially as a producer on Kaleidoscope, the old Arts Daily programme, now replaced by Front Row. Replaced but never bettered, I would say, of course. And then I moved to Radio 3 and did lots of art shows for Radio 3, and had a fantastic time as a sort of English student gone into the world of radio in some ways, especially since we're talking about that here today. Able to explore lots of my literary interests above all, and book writers, and go around and interview writers and see amazing things that writers did when you asked them questions. J.M. Coetzee, who we interviewed, not live because he refused to be live, knowing that he couldn't do it live, writing down the questions we asked him in a little pocket diary with his little stubby pencil, a Let's diary, I think, and then pausing for a minute or two before answering. Beautiful answers, but not good live, as we used to write on the index cards that we're no longer allowed to keep because they're dangerous for the Public Information Act, or whatever it's called, Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, so 20, 30 years of that, really, one way or the other, initially in London and then latterly in Bristol. More and more poetry, not so many birds actually in my work. I kind of kept the birds out. I was always very severe on colleagues' work where they were using, there was the gratuitous application of nightingales to soundtracks of radio dramas and things like that, and or manifestly incorrect species applied ahistorically or ageographically. So I would send
very pedantic people.
I sent pedantic memos saying, you know, you've used a common wide throat at the time when it's never been recorded in the British Isles. Kindly remake the program. So yeah, but then gradually, I mean, coming to the point of leaving the BBC, I found that I was talking to so many of my contributors about birds and my feelings for the natural world and my relationship with the natural world, and trying to make those things into programs when I could. Increasingly, the people eventually said, just shut up and start writing. You know, stop trying to make radio programs about these things when you know more about the subject behind the glass than the people are on the other side of the glass who are actually recording the program. You know, go and often do it yourself. And I'm, you know, grateful for the kick, of course. But I actually did intend to stay at the BBC forever, and I became totally institutionalized and loved it. Then I got ill and had a period off work and came back, and I found I couldn't do it anymore. It's got harder to do over the years, actually. Although I knew more and more about how to do it. I thought editorially, at least, it actually got harder to do professionally, and the sorts of programs I was able to make at the beginning of my radio career, even as a young novice producer, were harder and harder to sell, as you had to sell within the internal market of commissioning. So it wasn't, I ended up leaving a place that wasn't quite the same as I started in, but happily so.
Good. So well, two things about the BBC. One is that they did send you all around the world and paid for you to travel all around and see things. I mean, I saw something you wrote a few months ago about where you were naming all the people you'd met and the places you'd been, and it was an extraordinary name drop-a-thon and, you know, list of places.
Yeah, no, it was marvelous, and radio is very very portable and relatively cheap. It was just me and the tape recorder and Christopher Hitchens, and he paid for his own drinks bill.
Lucky.
So we were, you know, you can go undercover almost on a radio program. I did declare myself occasionally to customs people when I was going into various places, telling them what I was doing, but often I just went as a visitor. And had good times and recorded hours and hours of material and tried to make little programs out at the end of them. And I think also the BBC was, I mean, it would challenge me, I'm sure now, but it was also interested. It was more globally interested in those days than it seems to be able to be nowadays. Radio continues to have more of a global reach and mix of concerns and interests, but my poor junior colleagues who are still there struggle really to get out of Bristol or get out of London, let alone anything else. And things like the way we're talking now means that you don't need Christopher Hitchens and you to go to Cuba. You simply dial someone up in Havana and get some crackly line and something slightly substandard. Not that that's what we're doing, of course, substandard talk, but you know what I mean. Whereas actually the truth of it is that the real programs, the really good programs, come when you've trodden the ground and drunk the drinks.
I suppose the point I want to get at is that what the BBC gave you was this extraordinary preparation for writing life, and you left it quite late. I mean, you were nearly 50 when you published your first book.
Yeah, I was, and I always thought I wasn't. I actually came out of Selwyn English and Cambridge University with what I would have described as a kind of overdeveloped critical faculty and a rather repressed creative one. I mean, and repressed by the very critical intelligence that I'd acquired at university. In a way, I knew how bad my writing was even before I started writing, and that was thanks to reading the greats and being taught by some of the greats. So it took me a long time to feel that my squeaky little voice, one had a place on the broadcast side of the glass in the studio, if you like, but also on the page rather than just privately to myself. I'm amazed to see young writers these days coming out of university and English degrees and things, and that's all changed, and creative writing is everywhere. But in Cambridge English in the 1980s really killed creativity in a good way, I would still probably argue, because it was such a fantastically immersive education into the big books. And if you spend a lot of time with the big books, your own little book is ever littler.
But also, I mean, you said to me the other day when we were talking that you do think it's important to wait for the right time before you write something, that you let it mature inside you. And let's move on to this book, Greenery, because I think we probably spent too long on radio. But this, so this is your book about the spring, chasing, and you've written 3 books before that about different aspects of nature.
Yeah.
And edited a couple more. But this, one of the things that's interesting to me is that compared with your other books, it's much denser. There's a lot more in it. You sort of crammed the sentences full of things you want to say about the way nature looks and quotations from poetry. And it does feel to me like it's a book that you were kind of bursting to get out of you.
Yeah, that could be very bad, couldn't it? And maybe we should just talk about it as if it's a bad thing. It probably is.
Kill off your creativity.
I'm an over-writer, and I'm probably perhaps over lyrical and over glutted sometimes in the way I write, and sometimes the stuff is too much. But with this book, the real subject and the real story of what you're asking about is in some ways to do with the subject itself. Why is it so thick and dense and desperate, if you like? It's because it's about something that's going, and it's a book about a time of the year, but also a time of life, written by a man who's in the opposite season, as most of us are. As human life goes, we run from the spring to the autumn to the winter, perhaps, whether we like it or not. Magically, wonderfully, generously, the year goes around and renews. And so that tension between a man, me, going only in one direction, and this wonderful renewal, which I'd noticed all the time. It's something that birdwatchers, of course, pay attention to, because it delivers this new suite of magical singing birds in the springtime, swallows and swifts and everything else, to us in Britain. But I also noticed it as a man in his 50s, approaching 60s, with all sorts of things happening to him, illness, as I mentioned earlier, and change of life, and parents hovering on the edge of life, and children growing up in some cases, and in my case also a new child arriving on the scene. So wanting to think about how this magical and yet perfectly ordinary circular cycling of the world happens, and how someone who has, as everyone does, as they move through life, feelings that they are both in time, now is the springtime of our youth, our life, and also out of time. It's too late. We're winterish when it's spring again, and there's no green buds left for us, and all that sort of stuff. So the metaphorical power of seasonal change was something to be engaged with, on top of this wonderfully plain, if you like, but extraordinary exchange of birds that I've lived with all my birdwatching life, birds that come to us, and which I thought of as being at home, coming home to us in the springtime in Britain, but which actually, of course, turn out to be at home, as they are around me here in South Africa when they come here for their winter. So that needed to be grappled with as well, this feeling that the cycles and the circles are not ours, really. And yet looking at them, spending time with them, trying to travel with them is a kind of rather wonderful way of outstripping time, outwitting death, allaying death, extending your spring as long as you can, all those sorts of things. So that's why it's not just about the dates that the sandwich turn and the wheat year arrive in Norfolk.
But yeah, I mean, that's, perhaps you could say a little bit about how you came to have this strange life you have now, where you live between Cambridge and South Africa. So you're actually you've been living for a couple of years in almost perpetual springtime.
Well, I did last year. I had this last year, although now it's the spring is just beginning here. This is the spring equinox today, this very day in Cape Town, and we live in a village called Scarborough on the Atlantic coast, south of Cape Town, part of the greater sort of suburbs of the city, and our house is angled up against the fence of the national park, which is the Cape of Good Hope National Park, part of Table Mountain National Park. So there's actually, I calculated there's only one person who regularly sleeps nearer the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southwesternmost tip of Africa. And therefore, there's only one person who sleeps nearer to Antarctica than me every night down this part of the world. So that, and yet at the same time, there's also birds here, swallows, particularly barn swallows, the same barn swallows that we know and love in Britain, come here for their winters, for their summers here. Or tracking or flying a kind of perpetual spring, as you suggested, and so that was exciting and needed to be paid attention to. My wife is a Cape Townian, and she has a job at the university here. She also has a job in Cambridge, so we were lucky and able to spin between the two. Then I came here last year, and then probably got, in order for her to be around and to be a new father. A springtime and another autumnal person's life, me, and then got stuck here through the tribulations of the world. And it's a good place to think about. I mean, being at the bottom, my book ends up being a lot about the bottom, but even more about the very top. So where spring ends for me in Europe, up in the north of Scandinavia, in northern Norway and Finland and Sweden. Where in a way, if you want the maximum spring, you have to start with me here in Cape Town and end up there in the north of 60, north of the Arctic Circle, deep into July, you can get birds behaving as they've long given up behaving in Spain. The sorts of things they were doing in Spain in January, they're doing in Tromsø in July. And that's wonderful to discover and magical to see. And if you're looking for extension of spring, then that's the place to go.
I mean, you do have quite an unusual life for a bird watcher, because the bird watchers I know mostly stay in one place, occasionally travel, but they basically watch the birds obsessively as they come and go. And you've been traveling with them and seeing them in a lot more places.
Yeah. Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, we can't fly. That's a shame. I don't even dream about flying, actually. I do a kind of survey of people. I ask people whether they dream about flying. It turns out far more women than men dream about flying. And the women who dream about flying often have two different ways of getting aloft. Mostly women whiz up into the sky and very without effort. The few men who I've interviewed who fly in their dreams have to often use a lot of physical effort to flapping of arms and things in order to try to get up and out. Anyway, yeah, what was your question?
Now you distracted me, because I was thinking about my flying dreams. My flying dreams involve floating, not quite touching the ground.
Yeah, well, yes, we just, that's sort of slightly religious hovering.
Is this why you're interested in birds? Was it birds as flying creatures, as creatures loose from the ground, or was it just a kind of childish form of stamp collecting? You needed a hobby, and birds came along.
That's a good. Both of those points can be run together. I think. I think something about the way they kept on, that they moved. I've never got on with flowers, particularly. A lot of my friends and colleagues, and my wife indeed, are mad botanists. But because the kind of rootedness, which is something else to talk about in another place, perhaps, or another book, isn't my thing. What I love is the mobility, is the movement. And it's like, I mean, I now live adjacent to some penguins and next door to some ostriches, so I'm being challenged all the time by unbird-like birds, non-flying birds. But flight is the thing, and movement. And I mean, one of the things I always say when people ask me why birds is that partly because I know the opposite is the case for me, is that they move without hindrance. I mean, you don't see birds carrying bags, and I mean, birds without bags is the thing, and yet our attempts to follow them, my attempts to follow them, have been kind of cluttered and hindered with that awful little rattle of the small suitcase across the airport concourse, rather than this fantastic border ignoring high flight, across Europe, caring not for either the Eastern Bloc or for NATO or for the North Sea or the Mediterranean. And of course, lots of casualties along the way. But and to spend time with birds that are familiar to me in Britain as they began to cross the Sahara Desert, it was an extraordinary sight. Birds preparing and gearing up and committing themselves to flying over the desert. In such a way, these are tiny little gram-sized birds, and they do it more than once in their life. And amazingly, the first time they do it, they don't even know where they're going. They're coming from the north, having hatched in Europe, and their parents have already left them to their own devices. In most cases, for small birds at least, so they're flying on their own into the dark over the desert. And then, if they survive, if they make it across the desert, they'll turn around and come back the next day. Next year, knowing a little bit more about it, but not much more really. And so things like that. I mean, it was really hard to get to Chad, and we had to have special insurance and special security and permits and visas, and spent a lot of money on guards and drivers and all that stuff. And then we got there, and there were birds, the swallows and wheatears and warblers, that I knew from down the road in Cambridge, sitting in thorn trees and flying overhead, as if it was the, totally okay, cool place for them. So that was good. I love the way that trips us up in a way.
But I think we're probably getting towards the end of the conversation here. But the episode in Chad I found very striking in a couple of ways. One is you talk about going and shaking hands with the rangers there who are going against poachers and some of the nomads who live out there. And it occurred to me reading that wouldn't happen now. That now you'd be bumping fists or elbows or something. And that in that way, your book is a little bit of a lament for something, perhaps.
Yes,
a way of life that's going to be lost for us. And also perhaps a lament for the natural world, because some of these lives are very fragile now, these ways of existence that birds have.
Yes, I mean, there's two answers to that. One, I mean, my book came out in Britain in March of this year on the spring equinox, and it had to make and I was trapped here in Cape Town. It had to make its way airborne somehow aloft without me. And I think if it struck a chord with some people who were reading it at that time, as the country was going into lockdown and movement was curtailed, to be reading about and traveling with in ways which species and to places that were suddenly no longer available to people. And that's, there's the marvelous Ted Hughes poem that many people know about the swifts coming back in May in southern England, proving that the world is still working. What nature was doing through the lockdown time in Britain was, and the spring migrants, perhaps especially above all, arriving back from Europe, from across Europe, from Africa, was proving that the world was still working, even if we weren't. So that maybe continues to be the case. And then the second part of your question, yes, of course, we're also screwing up the spring in the ways that we're altering the climate of the planet, and that's written into the lives in desperate ways of some of the birds. Some of the birds are amazingly adaptable and seeming able to change, and are now taking the different caterpillars that are available when they arrive compared to the caterpillars they would have expected a few years ago, which have already been and gone, and vice versa. Other birds are getting it wrong. They're also getting it wrong on their wintering grounds, because that climate change is affecting the Sahel and Central Africa and places further south as well, here even in Cape Town. We just had a long, terrible drought here in Southern Africa a year or so ago, and actually now a wet winter, but all sorts of things are going on, mostly at our hands, of course. So spring is is both increasingly not available to us, perhaps in the pandemic viral world, although we see it going overhead, and we respond to its going onness, it's this wonderful permanent becomingness of it, and yet at the same time we also know that we are messing with the clock and screwing it over, so that, and one of the ways we even indeed know about climate change are these beautifully banal diaries kept by gardeners about their first cuts of their lawn, and birdwatchers likewise, the first time they hear a chiffchaff or a swallow or a sand martin or sandwich tern, those early migrants, and all those dates have galloped in some cases forwards. I mean, I'm now expecting to see a swallow in Britain 3 or 4 weeks before I would have been 20 years ago, and that's climate change.
I don't know if we should move on to the portion of the conversation where we take people's questions now.
Of course.
Certainly, yes, we could do that. So just to remind everybody, if you'd like to, if you have a question for Tim, please just submit it using the chat function, which is somewhere on your screen, probably at the bottom of your screen there. We've got some already. Tim, you were talking about swallows. Somebody wants to know, how long does it actually take for a swallow to fly from South Africa to the UK?
It's a good question. It's about 10,000 miles from, well, it's about 8,000 miles from Cape Town to the UK. On migration, swallows can fly at about 200 miles in a day. So I saw my last barn swallows, the same species, the regular species we know in Britain, here, just behind my back, on the fence, on the wire outside the back of the house, about the early April this year, and they may well have been due quite substantially north in Europe, because if it would take them 50 days to get to the 10,000 miles to the top of Arctic Scandinavia, which would mean they would arrive in late May, which is about right. And my friend Gabby Wagner, who features in the book, is a chronobiologist, duly sent me a message at the end of May this year saying there was snow still on the ground in Tromsø, but the swallows had arrived. So it may well, I would like to think it was the very same swallows I saw on 4th of April here. So it's 200 miles a day when they on migration. Their normal sort of hunting speed is much more like human walking pace, is about 3 or 4 kilometers an hour, something like that, 2 or 3 miles an hour. So there's a lovely way in which we can keep pace with the swallows. And in my book, I talk about swallows being available to us in the early new year in southern Spain, which is indeed when they first arrive in Europe, in southern Spain, just after Christmas often, and swallows arriving newly into northern Norway right at the end of the spring into June. So the whole of the spring, if you like, moves at swallow pace through Europe.
Thank you. Tim, you've mentioned a few times the things which are in your book. I don't want to put you on the spot, but Jane Hable, one of our audience, has asked, would it be possible for you to read out just a few paragraphs, just to give people a feel of your writing for those who haven't yet experienced it? Do you have a copy
I'm
to
surprised.
hand?
I do have a copy, yeah, but I could send it to Jane. Yeah, well, I better not read too much because that slows things down. But let me think. Would you want to ask me another question, and I'll think?
Yeah, certainly. We have another question here. Which writers about the natural world influenced you, or do you particularly admire?
Well, that's another big question. I mean, I love the science of nature. I mean, I love the factual writing of, and that's in some ways the most important thing for me. The things that tells me how birds live and how to identify them. So I grew up with a bookshelf of field guides and identification books and manuals on where to watch birds and elaborate descriptions of the molt progressions of birds and things like that. And at that point, as a child, a keen bird watcher, I was very much certain that that was what nature writing was descriptive writing of that kind. Later on, I mean, not much later, when I was a teenager, I suppose, I began to notice that there was non-scientific writing about birds that seemed to sort of speak to me, including things like Ted Hughes's fantastic collection, Crow. There's books, poems about crows. Not crows that I knew, but crows I sort of half knew, not quite as crazily, lysergically mad as Ted Hughes's crows. but nonetheless recognizable. And so then that began a kind of dual interest, I mean, in the writing about nature from a kind of creative point of view. I suppose that as a young reader, the book I discovered earliest as a 13 or 14-year-old was an amazing book that's been championed by many in the recent past, J.A. Baker's book, The Peregrine, which is an account, and I actually now think it's probably a novel rather than a factual account of watching peregrines in the Essex winters through the 50s, late 50s and the 1960s, at a time when the birds were rare, but still holding on there. They were rare because they were being globally poisoned in the end of the DDT insecticides and pesticides. So there was these toxic times and toxic birds, poisoned birds, that made for a very dark book, but amazingly powerful writing, extraordinary writing. And of course, I mean, there are great heroes of more contemporary nature writing in Britain. Richard Mabey is my #1 go-to man. I love the writing of Kathleen Jamie, both her prose and her poetry. She seems to manage a kind of fabulous approach and retreat towards nature, which is very important to me, this sense of not taking ownership of what she's looking at, but getting close to it as poets will. And then she wonderfully sort of leaves the object, the item, the natural thing, and steps back. And that stepping back is in itself a great lesson in how to live and how to, as well as in how to look. And so, yeah, that's been good. Should I read a little tiny bit?
Yes, please do. And
yeah, okay. Well, let me just read this bit, which will slightly repeat some of the things I've said, but maybe it makes it clear as to something. No, I'm not going to. Maybe ask me another question, Mike. Sorry, I'm just.
Okay, just slightly changing the tone a little bit. John Lambert has asked a question about why is there so little anger amongst many people who write about birds about the enormous decline in bird species?
Yeah, well, is there so little anger? I think Chris Packham's in trouble all the time for going on about these sorts of things, and the reaction of people to the decimation of the hen harrier population in the UK is pretty vocal. It's true that I'm not a writer. I mean, I write elegies, but they are elegiac, if you like, rather than angry. I mean, there are plenty. I mean, Mark Cocker, a great friend of mine, a great writer, is a furious writer. In his last book called Our Place, about our relationship through official bodies and nature reserves and conservation history of the last 50 years, is a very angry book. Rightly so. It's not for me. I mean, his book is for me, but it's not where I go. I mean, so it's a hard question to answer. I think you can find anger. Maybe even in J.A. Baker's The Peregrine, the anger of extinction is felt by that in that writing, and it's a good question though. I mean, worth thinking about. The Americans are maybe better at doing anger, although the Americans also have another parallel tradition of much more lyrical writing. I mean, Annie Dillard doesn't do anger. Bill McKibben does anger, but Bill McKibben basically is writing about environmental politics. Annie Dillard is still trying to write about what's happening in a pond, and so there are different horses for different courses. Okay. Right, I'm desperately trying to find a passage. Let me read a little bit from the Summit. Okay, here's a bit there's a favorite wood of mine in the southwest of England, in near Minehead, where my mother lives, which I go to as often as I can. It's a wood which is like a temperate rainforest, beautiful oak trees hanging down a steep-sided river valley. And in the springtime, it gathers 3 species of birds that are particularly totemic and important to me, a kind of holy trinity: the wood warbler, the red start, which is my favorite bird of all, and the pied flycatcher. And I go there as often as I can, and I have been going for 40 years plus. I'll just read this tiny paragraph about, which was a record of a day at the 2nd of May at Horner Wood. This is called Horner Wood in Exmoor. A fine rain was being blown sideways on a west-southwest wind. The wood carded cloud until it festooned the treetops. The oaks bowed their heads as if cowed by the weather. For an hour I felt like a sorry moth. The wet air of the cloud forest clogged my hair and misted my lenses. A male pied flycatcher knocked raindrops from its songpost twig. The water fell like tin tears along the twiggy stave. But even in the rain, on the great hillside lawn of tall oaks, there were paired redstarts and paired pied flycatchers and a singing wood warbler. All their sounds seemed softened, aptly so, in the submarine rainlight. Every bird I watched shook their feathers and shivered off a jeweled caddis sheath of themselves. A pair of pied flycatchers chased a female redstart. She chased them back. They were quiet, but their dancing movements lent a music of color and contrast, so that as they flew, the wood lit up and sparkled with the rain that they interrupted, as if the water falling around them was being worked in a woodland forge. Spangle, I wrote in my notebook, and watched the word slide from my page. I should say I have a wife. I have a wife who's a really hardcore scientist who vets all my stuff for pretension, or as I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this on the Selwyn College website, but for wank, as she calls it. So she goes through my manuscripts, putting a W in the margins if necessary. So I hope that passes the test, but you never quite know.
Well, Tim, that's an absolutely perfect way to, I think, bring to a conclusion this evening. We said we'd try and wrap up by 6:45, and I think we're more or less managing that. So thank you. That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for talking so candidly and you know, personally about your life and certainly how you came to write your latest book. To our audience, you know, Christmas isn't too far away, and I think Greenery would make a wonderful present. So hopefully you can cross that off your list. And Robert, thank you too for your very thoughtful and penetrating questions. It's really much appreciated. And this is the first time we've done an interview, but I'm sure it won't be the last. And lastly, thank you to our audience for joining us. It's much appreciated. We will be doing more of these events over the coming weeks and months as we are prevented from meeting more physically and more socially. But I certainly hope that you'll be able to join us on other occasions. So with that, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Robert. Bye-bye.